Hey everybody, welcome to a video that TseungTsu and I recorded talking about our first impressions for 9th edition 40k, going over some of our experiences with the lists and missions so far. I will preface this video saying this was recorded over the weekend, and this was before that we had a couple leaks, including the final points change leak, as well as the preview of the tournament packet table of contents, which gave us a little bit more insight into what the grand tournament booklet will contain. In our discussion about that book in this interview, maybe a little different with that information. So just keep that in mind when you're listening to this. Some of our opinions may have changed thanks to that news, but for the most part, I think the information and what we talk about in the interview is still relevant. So I hope you enjoy our first impressions of 9th edition 40k. I also have some gameplay of a recent 9th edition game that I played post-points changes up during the interview against a very strong Death Guard list run by my good buddy, the Shuma. While I don't think the game we played was 100% optimal, I do think that it demonstrates a couple of the things that I'm talking about in the opinions that I put forward on 9th edition in this video. Anyway, enjoy and have a good one. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevy, and I'm here with TseungTsu. And we're going to talk about 9th edition 40k. We've been grinding way too many games of the new edition, and we're going to talk about our thoughts, about our experiences. How's it going, Sung?
It's great, yeah. I mean, 9th edition 40k is the second best thing to happen in July. The first being the American tradition of the Nathan's hot dog eating competition.
That was pretty great.
It was amazing.
A lot of hot dogs.
Yeah, man. Joey Jaws Chestnut is a beast.
Yeah.
But I guess we should get back on track with Warhammer 40k 9th edition. So what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so we've been eating almost a record number of 9th edition games in the same manner that Joey Chestnut consumed hot dogs. And we're going to talk about our experiences with those games.
Yeah, so I think today we're really just going to go over our kind of initial impressions of 9th. We don't have final points for anything yet. And then one of the big things we wanted to mention right off the bat was that missions and secondaries are probably going to change. So they feel kind of weird right now. So we're really just trying to feel out the 9th edition rule set more so than the mission packet, right?
I mean, maybe they're going to change. People keep telling me that they're going to change, but as far as I know, nothing like that has been announced. So I guess that's the assumption, but at this point, I don't think we've seen any concrete evidence. They do have a tournament packet coming out, but I don't know if that's an entire mission structure or just addendums to the existing Eternal War missions.
Yeah, sorry, to be clear, yeah, we definitely don't know what's coming out, but I'm trying to not take this stuff too seriously right now. I'm trying not to worry about like building, min-maxing for different secondaries, which is obviously a big part of the ITC, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it definitely, the missions so far definitely feel like you can build to be very difficult to score against. And given how competitive the secondaries in the missions that we do have are, I think that is a direction to go into. I think I'm a little different than you. Basically, all I have to go on is the current mission packet that we've been playing, the Eternal War packet. And so, at least from what I can see right now, that's gospel in terms of competitive 40K. Definitely understand that may change in the future, but that's what we got. So that's what I'm playing with.
Yeah, so let's start there. What do you think about the mission packet so far? What do you think about the secondary? Yeah, let's start with the secondaries. That makes sense. Second first.
I think a lot of the concepts in the mission pack they're fine. I think they're well implemented, and the vision behind a lot of the ideas are cool. That it tries to mesh the thematic elements of your list creation and the missions that your faction would play into a standard secondary system. Unfortunately, from a development and gameplay standpoint, a lot of them are totally unplayable. Almost every mission that requires you to do an action is either will net you not enough points at all, or is extremely difficult to fulfill, and you'd be better off just picking a normal sort of board control secondary like domination or the recon equivalent, which are engage on all fronts, I think it's called. From that standpoint, the secondary standpoint, I think that there's definitely some improvements that could be made, and I think, in my opinion, the requirement for the Nova requirement to stand on an objective for entire round is exactly as bad and destructive as I sort of hope I was afraid that it would be. It makes the game extremely difficult and swing really hard one way or another early on in the game, and it's very difficult to come back from.
Yeah, so if you haven't looked at the packet, and we hope you have by now, basically all the primaries require you to...
I have a video on the channel reviewing all of the missions and secondaries as well. I guess we'll link that in the video. Boom! And then you can go check that out and report back. after you've watched it. So we'll give you a couple seconds to watch that video.
We're really just going to pause for a couple seconds. I guess we could do that.
All right, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that video.
Yeah, so hopefully you took from that video, for the primaries, you have to stand on them for the full round. And the secondaries, like Trevy said, are split. Some of them, a lot of the action-based ones, you do still have to stand up for the full rounds. Other ones, like Domination, you actually get to score at the end of your round. So I've definitely prioritized the ones that I have full control over, the ones I can just score on my round first. One of the weird things I've kind of struggled with, though, is like I take a lot of secondaries where I just know I'm not getting the 15. So how have you balanced that out yet?
I have tried to pick secondaries that are theoretically maxable, and especially ones that I'll sort of have tailored my list to. So a lot of times I'll build lists that have a high number of sort of MSU fast units. So I'm playing Tyranids for the most part. So I'll prioritize things like Hormagaunts and Gargoyles that are super fast and that can max things like Engage on All Fronts or Domination really quickly. Because unlike ITC, unless your opponent takes the attrition secondary, there's no benefit to killing more units in your turn. So there's not really any impetus not to just take a billion units of 10 guys. In addition, blast weapons now in the game make it so that if you take more than 10 models, you're actually a lot of times hugely punished, depending on the matchup. A lot of popular Space Marine lists or Imperial Guard can just wipe big units right down to that 10 model mark almost instantaneously anyway.
Yeah, the blast changes have definitely been different. Obviously, I mostly play Space Marines. It hasn't impacted me as much with unit size, but I've seen it on the other side of the table. And then as a Space Marine player, I've been trying to leverage attrition as much as possible. Even with the MSU-style Marines, right? They're obviously just more durable than their Tyranid counterparts or other counterparts out there. So I think attrition's a fantastic secondary. And when I look across the board, if it's not a Space Marine mirror matchup, which happens like 10 to 20% of the time, I've been able to ride attrition pretty well into some of the Xenos armies.
Yeah, I do like attrition as an idea for a secondary. I like that it takes a aspect that was in ITC and moves it to sort of an optional objective, and definitely punishes those MSU style armies a little bit. That said, you still have to, in order to max it, you have to do it 4 out of 5 rounds, which a lot of times is tough if your opponent's just throwing a bunch of garbage at you and you have to kill it all quickly in order to deny them points. And obviously it's not an action specific secondary, so I think it's actually a pretty good pick most of the time, and one that even on both sides of the table, a lot of times that you can still get a couple points on. Even if I'm playing a billion units, I can usually score attrition 2 to 3 times in a game if I'm playing conservatively.
So the most confusing secondaries for me are Mental Interrogation and Psychic Ritual, right? Which are, one's progressive, one's end of the game, but they're basically created or based around you casting a psychic action, right? What do you think about those?
Well, they're action-based, so I automatically think they're useless and a total waste of space. Yeah, for a couple of reasons. The first one being that psychic actions require you to expend all of your power casts for that model. So if you're a super sweet Inquisitor dude and you have 3 casts, doesn't matter. If you want to perform your psychic ritual, you use them all. You can't cast any more spells. In addition, your opponents can deny them. So sometimes you just don't score them. I took psychic ritual in a game that we streamed on AOWPI just earlier this week, and I was in a position to score it all 3 rounds in a row. And on round 2, my opponent just rolled a 10 to deny and stopped my psychic ritual. Like, I had 3 rounds where I could get the character into the right position to cast it, and that one deny stopped me from scoring 15 points. So I think psychic ritual probably is the most realistic of these, but it's still so dicey that I honestly very rarely see anybody taking it sort of in a competitive setting.
Yeah, it's one of those ones I could see having more value, like you said, if you have a bunch of cheap psychers, maybe that would be viable. But yeah, they've been very confusing to me. They've been really hard for me to kind of process, I guess.
Yeah, and even with cheap psychers, they have to be characters. So you can't do it with like Grey Knight Strike Squads or whatever, like Risen Rubric Marines or something like that could be good at it. You have to actually be a character. And then also you have to get them to that 6 inches of the center of the battlefield, which with a lot of the deployment zones isn't that hard, but you have to survive, to get to that point, which sometimes can be a little tough, especially for a little character who, as soon as they leave the safety of their 3-inch safety blanket and immediately die.
Are there any other secondaries you want to cover, or can we move on to the big missions?
Yeah, like I said before, I think a lot of the secondaries that sort of reward board position are the most interesting and the most eminently scoreable. So those, especially the battlefield supremacy ones, so engage on all fronts, line breaker, and domination, all three of which I think are pretty scoreable. And if you're building your army, you should be considering those. Obviously, I'm playing Tyranids. I'm playing an army with basically no resilience to it. Eldar are harder to kill than we are for the most part. So I'm trying to build towards these secondaries a lot, or at least one of the secondaries, because you can't pick more than one. In order to try to eke a couple points out from standing on objectives, because usually I'll lose on the primary points pretty quickly.
So yeah, so the primary points are the same, I believe, for every mission that we've seen in the Eternal War packet, right?
All but Vital Intelligence. Vital Intelligence has a slightly differently worded one. That's only because the interaction with objectives changes slightly in that mission. Instead of controlling objectives when you're standing on them, you flip them to your own control. And so the primary objective is changed a little bit to reflect that for however many you control that are flipped onto your side. Whereas all the other ones, are the same. They basically count for people who are standing on them.
So what are your thoughts on these so far? Mainly, we're focusing on the Strike Force mission objectives here out of the Eternal War pack.
Yeah, so I think I like the attachment of deployment zones to the missions a lot more than I thought I would, which is a little interesting. I like the idea that each mission, there could be 6 missions in a packet, but it really becomes 36 once you take into account that each one could have a different deployment zone. And then on top of that, sort of taking terrain into account, there's like an almost infinite combination of different missions that you could be playing. I was a little worried that tying the deployment zone to the mission would be a little boring, but we've been streaming a lot of board creation on AOWPI, and being able to know exactly where the objectives are and exactly what the deployments is means that we can make like some really interesting tables. At least on TTS, I think that's actually been a positive change. We'll see how it goes in real life, because I think a lot of those tables will just be set up, prior to the tournament or whatever that you're playing in, and you just get what you get. But so far, that's been the most interesting positive change to me that I wasn't expecting to like.
Yeah, I think for Tabletop Simulator in particular, kind of like you said, I really like the idea that designers were able to create maps with a deployment zone and a mission in mind, right? So you can make sure that one objective is, out of line of sight and the other one is not, hypothetically speaking, and other cool things like that. I think that's a really cool advantage to playing online, which obviously most of us are doing because of COVID. I like you said, I don't see that happening at the big events, right? I don't see an RT or a GT changing terrain every round, but it would be kind of cool if they did.
We could maybe see stores with kind of more standardized terrain setups, or maybe terrain tables have diagrams for how the terrain gets set up depending on the deployment zones, or maybe player place terrain even. I think that could be an option, especially since it becomes a lot more feasible with a smaller table. You get less like weird sort of like asymmetric setups when you have less area to just corner stuff, basically.
So a couple of the other things I wanted to hit on that were kind of jarring almost, right, are things like No Man's Land. What do you think about the addition of that?
Specifically in reference to the special mission rule that removes forward deployment from people, so the concealed positions and infiltrator style pregame movement. It takes away. You just have to set up and complete moves completely in your deployment zone. I actually think that's pretty cool, and I like that it allows for an objective setup that's like this, where all of the objectives are extremely clustered together right in the middle of the table, where both players can get to them, and units like scouts or Raven Guard that can really just dominate that center area with pregame movements. I think reducing their effectiveness in that situation is really cool. I think it's one of my favorite missions so far, just because it engenders like a ton of conflict in the middle, which is pretty sweet. And I do like that we have seen those forward deploy elements be extremely powerful in 8th edition, and this seems like the design team sort of recognizing that, which is I think interesting.
Yeah, I think my biggest complaint is that the mission rule and the mission are named the same thing. Like, I don't understand why they're both called No Man's Land. Would prefer one of them to have a different name. I think it's really interesting, right? It's an aspect they brought in from Age of Sigmar, where they're fundamentally changing, quote unquote, the rules of the game as you kind of go into it. So I like the addition of it. It was surprising the first time I played on it. The first time I played in that mission, I think it was actually against you. And I think I was bringing 4 infiltrating units.
Yeah. You had some just infiltrator squads, I think, that were a little sad.
Yeah, but it's fine. It's a good check and balance. And I actually really like the addition of things like that. And I like that they are exploring different kind of design space within the missions.
Yeah, and obviously these mission special roles, as opposed to ITC, which basically the mission itself just told you, where the objectives went for the most part, and the bonus point sometimes came into play. I like that these can sort of forge a narrative a little bit more than ITC missions do, but not to the extent that it's unbalanced. I think that this might be the most unbalanced one because it removes abilities that you sort of paid for in your list, I guess. But some of the other ones, like the objectives that you can blow up or vital intelligence that we talked about before, which instead of controlling the objectives, you hack data terminals. Like, I think that's cool. It feels kind of Infinity-esque in how the missions are set up, and I think it's overall a positive change. Meshing the competitive side and the narrative side of the game is definitely always a positive.
So I don't have anything else about the mission specifically I wanted to talk about. Was there anything you wanted to hit on there? Otherwise, I just had some general things about the Eternal War packet.
Yeah, I don't have anything about the missions. I haven't played too many of them, mostly for the single point that the map base in TTS doesn't have the Dawn of War deployment in it yet. So that we've been playing all the other ones. So I don't have a lot of wide breadth of experience on all of them. So far, they've been fine. I've enjoyed them a lot more I've enjoyed sort of the differences between the missions a lot more than I expected. But I do have some choice words to say about the primary objectives. I don't think that this is a great mystery, but I think that having to control the objective at the start of your turn rather than the end of your turn is entirely inappropriate for a game as lethal as 40K is. It removes the competitiveness of a ton of different units. Light infantry, between the blast rules change and this mission rule, are effectively useless. There's no situation in which they can stand on an objective for more than one turn. And having to control an objective for an entire round makes it extremely hard to come back on the primary objective, because as soon as your opponent takes control of an objective from you, it takes you sort of 2 full rounds to get it back from them, because you have to then kill them and then take the objective yourself. So, and especially that's compounded with the fact that the games last one less round and scoring isn't available on the first round, which I think is good from a balance standpoint. But there's 4 rounds in which you have the opportunity to score rather than 6 like you did in ITC. So if your opponent comes out of the gate swinging or is able to sort of force you back in the early game, you just lose the game. That's it. You might as well concede there. You get into a lot of situations where it's impossible for you to score any more points on the primary objective, and a lot of the secondary objectives kind of peter out at that point as well. So regardless of, unless you want to count kill points, your battle points or points destroyed to measure the size of your dick, I guess you might as well just call the game. With the goal of making the game shorter, I certainly think that has been accomplished by GW, but I think it's at the expense of the game being less balanced and less fun to play. So that sucks.
Yeah, but how do you really feel, Trevy?
Yeah. A lot of the games that I've been playing have been extremely one-sided one way or another. Either sort of I go first and I'm able to constantly keep my opponent off balance, or my opponent's able to basically just shoot all of my forward stuff, and then I never get the chance to get on the objective. I have had very few close games in 9th edition. I think the one that we played on No Man's Land, I would think was the closest one. It was a couple points different. But other than that, almost every game that I played have been like a 50-point differential between the two players.
Yeah, I mean, I've been playing a lot of different weird lists, so I don't read too much into my data. But yeah, actually, that the game we played is actually my only close game out of 13. Every other one is basically a tabling or a forfeiture, just due to scenario pressure. So that is an interesting data point. Like I said, we'll need more to it. I'm still optimistic we're going to get different missions. I know that's kind of conjecture, but we'll see what happens. But it's definitely been different having to camp on the primaries for that long. And Trevy and I playing different armies that have very different skewed views of it. It's easier for salamanders to kind of pivot to like, okay, well, I'm just going to stick tanky Primaris models on these things, right? As opposed to a lot of other armies that don't have that option.
Yeah, so out of curiosity, what do you think the chances are, were we to get a new mission packet in the tournament rules, that this primary objective would change? Because it seems to me like it seems very low that they would sort of wholesale change how objectives are scored between the two formats.
I actually think it's pretty low as well. I think one or two of the missions might have a different primary, if that makes sense. But I think the bulk of them will be this primary format that they've kind of outlined, which is you need to sit somewhere in the middle of the board for an entire round to score some points. My hope is that the secondaries get a little more competitive, and that can kind of breed maybe closer games, and you get into like denial and stuff like that, right?
The secondaries definitely have been the most interesting part of the game that I've played so far. And honestly, we're still we're playing deep inside spoiler season right now, right? We don't have any updated points, like you mentioned right at the top. And we don't know how the full balance of the game is going to come out. But it seems to me right now that if you're not playing sort of a select group of factions that have all of the tools needed to complete, which mostly just means like just hyper tanky units that you can shell damage out with at range. Melee typically is basically a non-starter in this edition, in my experience. That can sit on objectives and just kill your opponent off of their objectives. You might as well sort of not show up. There's a couple factions that it looks to me like can compete. And otherwise, the other factions just, I guess, switch over or go home.
Yeah, see, I still think we disagree on Melee in general being a non-compete. I've enjoyed Melee. I just think it's very, very, very different kind of Melee. I think using Melee to control what a model shoots is actually very powerful. And I think using Melee to just deliver, X Thunderhammer swings or something, that's powerful. But yeah, I mean, the kind of Melee that I know that you were doing, where you're getting a bunch of genies or a bunch of anything onto a single target, that's almost impossible to do now, right?
Yeah, sort of melee infantry, especially, their damage output is basically, it doesn't matter. They're not going to do anything in melee unless you're fighting sort of across a wide front. So melee infantry are good at killing other infantry, and I think that's, depending on how we see the meta evolve, that may be a direction that it could go. Play another game on stream against Shuma, and he brought 75 Zinch horrors to the table, and I was sort of missing, having like Gene Stealers or just like sort of a big lawnmower unit that could come in and punch them up. But in almost no other situation is that same Gene Stealer unit going to do any damage. To mention the fact that in 8th Ed, the way the Gene Stealers would sort of recoup their investment, because they're a very expensive unit, is they would try to protect themselves from ranged attacks by engaging stuff. That doesn't matter for a multitude of reasons. Now, obviously, things can just fall back out of wraps. So with a 2CP strat, you can also just shoot them while they're in melee. Almost everything that is played on the table has a pretty wide breadth of anti-infantry sort of defensive guns, and that don't rely entirely on blast. I just played against a list the other day with 3 Redemptor Dreadnoughts in it, and any one of those is going to kill like 8 Gene Stealers as soon as it gets engaged. So certainly that type of melee unit, I think, is not very competitive anymore. And I liked your point that controlling what units can shoot at is important and is impactful. And I've definitely sort of been playing more with that in mind. But the downside is that, at the end of the day, you're trading models into nothing, basically. You're just sort of stalling your opponent's damage output, whereas they're not actually losing anything. They're still killing your army.
Yeah, I mean, that's not what I described isn't what we want to use Gene Stealers for, right? Which are a very elite costed infantry model. Just talking about their costs when I say elite, right? I'm when a normal gaunt serves the same purpose just as well, sure. Right? You'd much rather bump in with the gaunt because the couple attacks you're getting from the genie, like you said, most of the time don't matter.
At the end of the day, though, like if I go and engage a Dune Rider with a unit of infantry, that forces that Dune Rider to shoot at my infantry, which is what it was going to use those guns to do anyway. So it's not like its damage output is actually mitigated. Engaging blast weapons to stop them from shooting big things like sometimes matters, but it's been way less consequential in the games that I've played so far.
Controlling where they shoot, I still think is important, right? Yes, they're going to kill a squad, right? But it might be a squad that's not in an objective or something like that. And we talked about the primary objective just a few minutes ago. So I definitely think there's value there. I think there's counterplay there. And just I think it's something worth exploring. So as we kind of talk about area control and zone control, though, I did want to talk about the impact of the smaller board has been much more impactful than I initially thought it was. How is that kind of lined up with your initial expectations?
Definitely, I think it's a learning curve. I'm still getting used to it. There's definitely some short range units that obviously have been extremely benefited from the smaller board size because your opponent can't sort of escape. I think 24 to 36 inch range guns are way more playable now than they were in 8th Ed. And in addition, I actually think the more impactful part is just the requirement that you stand on objectives, because that also that in addition brings that smaller or brings those shorter range guns into play, whereas your opponent can't quite easily hide and kite you with objectives that are strewn around the map. I think a lot of people are worried that it becomes a super alpha strike game, and I haven't felt that as much. I think going first gives you a lot of presence on scenario, which is very good, obviously. But I guess I may not have played against the matchups where they alpha strike super hard. I know some people are worried about units or factions like Blood Angels that if they get a good deployment and can deploy aggressively and go first, they could just absolutely smash you. But we'll see how it goes. I'm interested to play with it. I like the smaller board just from a logistical standpoint as well. Just having an extra 12 inches on the side of the table to put your tray down is going to be nice once we get back into real space games.
Very impactful for any kind of drop troop that I've been using, right? Anytime coming in, it's so much easier to zone out of meaningful engagements on the table. That's been a very interesting thing to weigh, kind of, right? We have league points for the Space Marines, right? So Grav Devastators look really, really appealing, right? But it's actually been really hard for me to get drop pods in range between the new disembarking rules and just the smaller board of the big things I need to hit. So things like that have definitely been interesting, and definitely as you kind of dive into 9th edition, keep that in mind. The table is almost 25% smaller, and just finding footprints for these drop troops has been much, much more difficult for me. I did want to talk about what you just said there with the Alpha Strike armies, which obviously go hands in hand with the deploying before you know who goes first. This has been very interesting. The Blood Angels player or someone like that definitely can get a huge advantage if they deploy aggressively and go first. The flip side is, are you able to punish them enough for the 50% of the time that they don't go first? And then how do you value redeploy strats or powers in this current meta?
Yeah, so obviously it's basically the deployment out of most of the missions in the 2019 ITC packet. So you go back and forth deploying. There's no benefit to finishing first, so having less drops than your opponent is just worse. And then there's a second roll to actually take the first turn. And that has been, honestly, hasn't super impacted me too much. I've been finding, maybe it's just the list I'm playing, and maybe it's the terrain that I'm playing on, that I think a lot of my deployment is dictated from the start, and I'm not changing much in order to mitigate my opponent's alpha strike. I don't know if that, like I said, if that's a combination of the matchups or the terrain. I think we tend to play with a lot of terrain. And I wonder how much, now that I'm thinking about it more, it seems like maybe even removing some of the terrain in the center of the table makes the game more interesting, but I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, it's been fine, and I think the biggest downside is it's kind of a time sink. I think deployment's sort of the single longest phase now, whereas your turns actually don't take that long because you generally have smaller armies and you're losing stuff more quickly. Deployment is just kind of a pain.
It can definitely take a long time. A lot of my games have gone quickly. Like, if this was a serious competitive game, I could definitely see you spending a lot of time fiddling with weird deployment. It's interesting what you said about removing terrain. See, I think I've been playing on a lot of terrain-heavy boards too. A, to just kind of test out and flex the new terrain rules, which you did a great video on, and I slept through. And B, to try to make it interesting with lots of kind of like hidey holes. I do think that might be interesting if you remove that, if there were less places to deploy aggressively and safely. If the Blood Angels player, for example, were still willing to kind of deploy so far up. But this is a part of the game I thought I would hate. I really, really, really thought I would hate this almost as much as you hate the primaries, but I've actually enjoyed it. I actually think it's a pretty cool, welcome addition to the game for myself.
Yeah, I think I feel very strongly about it either way. I think I don't like it in the fact that it takes longer time, but that's about it. And I think it's fine either way. It has to be some concessions to be made that have to be made in case your opponent goes first, which is an interesting dynamic. And there's a trade-off, like whether you try to deploy for the first turn alpha strike or you try to deploy more defensively and have less of a stellar first turn. I think that's always an interesting consideration. To the point on the objectives, I actually think that the way forward might be to sort of heavily fortify the deployment zones so that first turn alpha strike is a little bit less impactful. Like, you don't kill as much going first, but that if you remove the terrain in the center, it actually it doesn't allow already resilient units to sort of compound their resilience, which is something I've been noticing a lot. Like intercessors that are, behind an obstruction and dense cover become extremely difficult to deal with. Whereas if they're out in the open, almost anybody can kill them. And it brings the game back to a level playing field. I don't know if that's the direction that we want to go because it seems super boring, but it seems to me like it may be less imbalanced, I guess.
I think my only comment on terrain, and this is even more BS than my normal gas bagging, I would love to see less breachable terrain. I think players in general have hung on to the breachable term from ITC packs previously. So a lot of the maps I'm playing on, like everything is just breachable. I think it would be a lot more interesting if infantry had to, like you said, risk moving out into the open more often to get places. Right now, I think in almost all of the games I've played, there's just so many things are breachable. Like infantry just aren't really inconvenienced to move around the map. Does that make any sense?
No, absolutely, and it's certainly. I know in sort of in our private chats, I know we have this discussion quite a bit. I'm of the opinion that I think because they're slower and less resilient, infantry are a lot worse than sort of an equivalent points in armored vehicles usually, and especially in this edition where armored vehicles are very rarely inconvenienced by things. I think infantry do need a little bit of a leg up, and breachable terrain definitely helps that. On the flip side, I do see the point that sort of having a bunch of breachable terrain on the table kind of makes it a non-issue for infantry. And I do think that almost every table needs a little bit of sort of unstable terrain or something that makes it movement difficult for them. But I still think that infantry do need that sort of mobility assist in order to be able to get to those objectives, because you do have to, not only do you have to stand on them for a full round, but you got to make it there first. And sometimes that's hard.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm not saying we get rid of breachable. I just think personally, I've been seeing too much of it on maps. I've been seeing 6-8 pieces of it, and that just seems excessive. So I think we both agree, though, that the new deployment rules are far better than Seize the Initiative, right?
Yeah, thank God that didn't come back. You can take my 10 points for not playing painted, but please don't put Seize the Initiative back in. Oh my God.
So this conversation, I think we're at a good point here, Trevy. I hope that our second pass look at the missions that we're playing on and our thoughts for competitive play were helpful to you. Trevy, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it was a pretty reasonable discussion given our first impressions on the edition. And I think it's going to be interesting to revisit this video in like a month or so after we do know if these are the final mission packet sort of for competitive play. And we do know the points changes and all these things that could drastically change our outlook. I think it's going to be an interesting journey, and I'm excited to see how the competitive meta shakes up. And with that, we're going to wrap the video. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We hope you enjoyed this little discussion, and you are getting lots of games in 9th edition and forming your own opinions. Let us know down in the comments whether or not you agree with the takes that we've had so far. And let us know what kind of stuff you've been finding effective, whether you can make that light infantry good or are just focusing on putting a bunch of Scorpius on the table, which I think is going to be a pretty good list. Thanks for watching. Want to give a big shout out to my Patreons for supporting the video. Did you know that if you support the channel on Patreon, you will get early access to videos, exclusive videos that don't go up on the public channel, and don't have this little segment of me talking about how cool my patrons are for a full minute. Hope everybody has a great time and is having a good time playing 9th edition 40k so far. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.